Hey, good morning. Happy Wednesday. A couple of announcements before we get started today. One, I'm still working through Flipgrid. I'm not as tech savvy, so I don't have it as together as I would have liked by this point of the week. I want this unit's response to be on video because I want to kind of vary it and change it up. I don't want you guys to feel monotonous and just writing. So working on the Flipgrid response video access, but I've had a bunch of papers due for grad school, and it wasn't able to connect on Flipgrid correctly as quickly as I thought it would yesterday. So probably the video response to this unit won't be due until next week. I know I said Friday, but I'll probably push it out to like next Tuesday so that I can get it all in place. What I will do today is post just the short questions that you'll respond to, and the video is only meant to be a couple of minutes long, but the responses will be, about the discussion we've been having, the idea of what Christian hope looks like, and into maybe what a Christian response should look like. And that's what I want to talk about today a little bit, is Christian response. Second announcement is yesterday I posted in each of the classes a second very, very short reading. It's like 3 pages of N.T. Wright from his book Simply Christian. It supports the stuff from John Eldredge. I have found that these ideas from these two authors are very, very helpful in understanding the shape of Christian hope, what it really looks like, what it really looks like to be hopeful even in the midst of grief, and so forth. And so I want you to read that too. One of the questions from the video response will be to connect to the reading. I'm hoping that you're doing those readings. They're, I think, pretty straightforward readings, so it should be pretty easy for you. In the meantime, today what I want to do is talk about sort of a principle for Christian response, and not necessarily particulars of Christian response to COVID-19. And then if we have time going forward, maybe get into some of the more particulars, because there are very, very important decisions that are being wrestled with right now, and people are, of course, getting a little anxious about, when will we reach this tipping point and open society back up a little bit? And because if we don't open up society, doesn't that have its own repercussions? And so there are some particulars that are worth talking about, but for today, I want to give it more of a principled response. There's lots of places to turn in order to start thinking about a principled Christian response to an era like ours, a situation like ours. One of the places I was drawn to as I was thinking about it, though, was a fairly obscure saying from Jesus. What I mean by obscure is that people don't tend to think about it or utilize it in sermons or whatever. But in Matthew chapter 10, verse 16, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's talking about sending them out into the world, which I think is sort of relevant to our discussion. And he says, "Listen, I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves." And Jesus is a master teacher, and he paints very vivid pictures. And I think this is a vivid one too. This idea that we would be shrewd and innocent. I think it's an interesting sort of tension to hold on to as we move into something like COVID-19 or any other very practical threats that our world might actually experience. What I mean is, we shouldn't be quick to differentiate between a sort of spiritual response to say, as a Christian, when there's trouble, what I do is pray and trust in God. We shouldn't think that that is somehow mutually exclusive with the idea of saying, when there's trouble, I leveraged, scientific skill set and medicine and best economic principles. Those two things are not in competition with one another. And so one of the principles I'd like to lay out there for us is that as Christians, we shouldn't be thinking only spiritually as we seek to, protect and to support our world and our families. And on the other hand, we shouldn't only be thinking practically. We should be holding the two together. And there's historical precedents for that. Historical precedents for plague is something that we mentioned earlier in this little mini unit here. But Christians actually garnered a reputation for taking care of the sick and the dying. But when they did so, they didn't only pray. They did pray. Of course they prayed. They of course sought miracles and hoped for miracles, and in some cases experienced them. But they also leveraged the best signs that they knew. It may have been quite limited in many of these eras of plague that Christians lived in and fought against, but it was the best that they had available to them. And the results were remarkable. They rescued people. They saved people. This was effective to the point that actually pagan philosophers and leaders were frustrated by it. Very famously, an emperor named Julian the Apostate, who was emperor after Constantine, was angered when he saw the growth of Christianity because of the way they took care of the poor and the way they took care of the sick. And he said, man, that we've got to do something about getting rid of Christianity. Their reputation is, growing just because they take care of the poor and the sick and they save lives. And he said, we should do that. As a pagan himself, he said, we should do that. And so what we actually can see historically is Christians doing what I'm proposing. They're doing their best with the physical, skill-based side of it, while also being very, very spiritual and conscientious in their prayer life and their desire for God breaking through. And they're doing this all in a very self-sacrificial application. They're loving their neighbors the way that they would hope to be loved and taken care of if they had fallen ill. And so I propose that we should do both. And I believe Christians are doing both. I've been in on conversations with churches and organizations that are already working on this in many ways. Supplying food banks. And I know of a church the chapel is a pretty big church in Akron, actually opened up its gymnasium for the homeless during this. They're running a homeless shelter during the time of COVID. And you may be aware that there are many studies that say that COVID-19 is very widespread within the homeless community. There's studies out of Boston that there were high percentages of the homeless that had COVID, and we can assume the same is true in various locations. And the chapel said, we're going to do something about this. We're going to protect them as much as we can. We're going to bring them into our church. So they are very self-sacrificially doing that. And then there's work to be done. I've listened to Australian pastors talking about the work that they want to do, British pastors talking about the work that they want to do. This is the time for the church to be the church, not only in spiritual guidance and prayer, but also leveraging the physical resources that we have. Samaritan Purse has been setting up clinics, and they set one up in Central Park. They're doing the work with the expertise that they have available to them. They're doing the work that they can do. So another way that I think we can be sort of shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves is in terms of policy. In this sense, we have a bit more knowledge, of course, than the ancient Christians did. Ancient Christians sort of rushed into the trouble to take care of the sick. But for many of us, we realize we don't have much to offer when it comes to caring for the sick the way that a doctor could. And actually, maybe the best thing we can offer is to be willing to self-isolate, even to great inconvenience for ourselves. And what we end up realizing is that we're cutting off exponential growth. Every branch of the virus's advance that we can cut off through isolation and self-isolation is an essential step. So we are innocent as doves by listening to the policies put in place by experts and authorities. But of course, we also want to be very, very well informed ourselves and thoughtful ourselves, and whatever expertise we have, we want to leverage it. And so we want to seek to inform those policies to make sure that they're as shrewd as possible, especially as we start to wonder where the tipping point is between a shut down society and trouble on the horizon economically, which would lead to other people being put in dangerous situations. So I think we have to see this principle at work, this balance between shrewdness and innocence, innocently taking the words of the experts to heart, but shrewdly saying, what are the best policies? Can we shape our policies in that direction? And our goal as those who are innocent is always to love our neighbors, the most vulnerable. We want to be proactive in the ways that we do that. Can we deliver food to the elderly in our neighborhood? Can we find a way to make sure that the food pantries are full? Can we make sure that there are, masks for everyone? Proactive ways, but also seeking to halt the exponential growth of COVID-19 through stillness and through self-isolation. This tension, I think we've got to balance it. Our Christian response has to hold on to both those things. And I think Christians are very well positioned to do that. But I do want to encourage you to be in prayer, not just for inner peace for yourself and for protection for your family, but I would encourage you to be seeking a breakthrough from God. I think that miracles are, of course, an interesting conversation, but there are actually plenty of academic studies about miracles done by Christian scholars and non-Christian scholars alike that talk about the reality of inexplicable events that take place. I think we should be seeking that. That's one of the things we see as the priestly role of human beings is to intercede on behalf of the world. We disseminate God's blessing to the world as much as possible, like Abraham was called to do. We are blessed to be a blessing. If you're interested in the concept and understanding of miracles and evidence for miracles, there's a really good entry-level book on it by Lee Strobel. It's very entry-level. It's certainly not the most academic thing out there, but he does interview some of the more academic people on the topic of miracles and evidence for there being miracles happening around the globe today. It's just called The Case for Miracles. Maybe you'd be interested in getting it from Amazon during this time and reading it. One of the most important interviews he does in that, it's a lengthy portion of the book, is with a man named Craig Keener, who's a very, very talented scholar and spent a long time in his career working on the evidence for miracles from around the globe, as he believed he and his family had experienced miracles. And he put together about a 3,000 page work, 2 volumes, 3,000 pages of evidence of miracles that he parsed out very, very academically. He didn't just take every story that came his way, but he tried to study it as academically as possible. And maybe that would be encouraging to your faith to read that right now, but also encouraging to your Christian response to say, we will be practical, as shrewd as possible, but also innocent and seeking God's intervention as much as possible too. We need to hold on to both of those if we're to have a thoroughly and truly Christian response. Let me know if you have any questions about the readings. I promise I'll get the questions posted that you'll be thinking about for your video, but like I said, you probably won't actually be producing your video until early next week. I hope you're doing well, and I hope to hear from you. See ya.